And now we can move to our next speaker, which will be Daniel Spencer from University of St. Andrews, Scotland. I can see that Daniel is with us. Hi, Daniel. I will display Daniel's talk right now, and please keep all the questions for the discussion after the lecture. Thanks. And one thing more, I forgot about the title. Daniel will give a talk on the mysticism and philosophical analysis, some Christian strategies.
Good afternoon, everybody. The title of this talk is Mysticism and Philosophical Analysis, Some Christian Strategies. A brief roadmap of what's to come. We will begin with just some background and definitions, the what and the why of this presentation. And I hope you'll understand a bit more of the motivations for this project. So we'll define our terms and look in particular at what sort of problems Christians might see in the study of comparative mysticism. Then we'll take a look at some prior work done in the field. We'll look at R.C. Zahner and the more analytically minded Nelson Pike. After which I will very, very briefly offer a first step anyway for a constructive proposal of my own and how we might further engage this field as Christians. So there has been some recent Christian work done in the past 20 or so years, but not a lot has been written. This isn't quite everything, but it's almost everything, at least as far as I can tell. So that's one of the things motivating this project, is the fact that a considerable gap, and I think in the Christian witness, can be seen simply from the lack of engagement with comparative mysticism. And this is not, of course, mysticism simpliciter or Christian mysticism, but I mean comparing and contrasting the different paradigms of spirituality and how Christians might understand non-Christian mystical experience. Now, coming to a definition of mysticism, a bad definition is that offered by Ninian Smart, for instance, where he says mysticism refers to those inner visions and practices which are contemplative. You see this a lot. Definitions that are far too vague need further defining. A psychological definition you'll see sometimes, such as the one here, a series of discrete modes of experiencing the self that function to impose the unity of the self on whatever the self is bound up with. Well, again, very vague. It leaves more questions to be asked than questions answered. And I think it's a bit question-begging as well if we take a close look at it. As Gershom Scholem once said, there are almost as many definitions of the term as there are writers on the subject. So we need to be very, very careful and indeed partially stipulative when we offer our own definitions of mysticism. So here's mine. This is what I mean by mysticism. Any state of consciousness which phenomenologically is A, unitive, that is, the mind is emptied of all subject-object distinction or differentiated content. B, a state that acquaints the subject with a truth or reality that is not obtainable by ordinary sense perception, reason, or introspection. You see this a lot in the Upanishads, for instance, where the lower sciences, there's the lower ways of knowing, such as theology, philosophy, rites, give way to the higher mode of knowing, which is mystical experience. And this sort of negates all of the lower ways of knowing. And then finally, this experience carries with it virtual certainty as to the veracity of the insight inquired. William James's noetic quality. The mystic simply sees and knows that he has seen reality as it is. Okay, so what? And I have actually quite a hard time convincing other Christians that this is something important to deal with. Elsewhere, I've written a decent amount on this. Just for our purposes today, I'll say two things. First of all, the conjunction of A, B, and C, that is, a mystical experience, almost certainly and does inevitably carry with it profound metaphysical import in the eyes of the mystic. Such that if mystical experiences are indeed cognitive, that is, if they latch on to reality, then plausibly monism or pantheism or religious pluralism follows. This is a claim that is very, very common in the mystical literature. Perhaps a more difficult charge to deal with comes from within Christianity itself, actually, and that's that mystical experience or the height of contemplation is what Christianity is really about. So all of our theology and Christian philosophizing really is pointing to mystical experience, such that once we attain that enlightenment, the rest can be jettisoned. So as one Benedictine monk of the middle 20th century says, whoever in his personal experience has discovered the self has no need of faith in Christ or of prayer or communion with the church. And this is precisely because those are the lower ways of knowing, and he has attained the real with a capital R. Thomas Merton, a very famous mystic, has made some similar claims. I won't get into that now, but I'm happy to talk about him a bit more in the Q&A if we have time. Now, turning to R.C. Zaehner, he's most famous in the field of comparative mysticism for the typology of mysticism he offered. He really represents the first systematic attempt to classify mysticism by type, and he is followed and critiqued by many others later on. So the three main types of mysticism for Zaehner: first, we have the panenhenic, or the nature mysticism, where the everyday self or ego melts away and an all-embracing non-dual consciousness of all in one and all emerges. You see this often in philosophical Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and some of the Upanishads. Secondly, there is the mysticism of pure isolation, or monism. Introvertive mysticism is what W.T. Stace called it. And this is where there is no sense experience at all, so we withdraw from the external world, empty the mind of all conceptual content, and a feeling of absolute oneness ensues. And this seems to be the authentic teaching of the historical Buddha, for instance. You see this in the Vedanta and sometimes in Sufism, as well as in some Christian mysticism. I have Meister Eckhart in mind. Note that these are both robustly monist, always phenomenologically, of course, but more often than not, perhaps 90% or 95% of the time, they are said to yield metaphysically monist conclusions as well. Now, more controversially, R.C. Zaehner introduces a third type of mysticism, theistic mysticism, where the absorption of the ego is this time not into some vague, undefined entity, but into the divine essence itself. So Zaehner says that both the individual personality and the whole objective world are entirely obliterated in the Godhead. Now, what's very interesting to note about this case of theistic mysticism is that it is an explicitly dualist metaphysic insofar as there's God on the one hand and the individual soul on the other, and ontologically, never shall the twain meet. But phenomenologically, it does seem to be akin, if not identical, to type 2 here. Now, this is where Nelson Pike picks up on where Zaehner leaves off. He hasn't written too much on comparative mysticism, but what's there is very interesting and very profound and helpful for further study. And I want to just look at some of his contributions from Mystic Union. So Pike talks a bit about Zaehner, and he starts with the observation that W.T. Stace and Ninian Smart criticize Zaehner for essentially smuggling some theology into his third type of mystical experience. So theistic mysticism is an ex post facto interpretation of monist mysticism. And again, this is artificially derived from prior theological commitments. The only reason, they say, Zaehner has a third type is because, well, he's a Roman Catholic and there needs to be a third type of mystical experience, or else he's courting heresy. Now, Pike is interesting because he says the charge against Zaehner is essentially correct, yet he still wants to maintain against Stace and Smart that there are three distinct phenomenological types of mysticism. Now, through a close reading of one of Zaehner's texts, Pike highlights the issue for Zaehner. He says that whereas the phenomenological descriptions of experience ground extrovertive and introvertive, that is, nature and monistic mysticism, when Zaehner introduces the concept of theistic mysticism, the examples that he uses seem to be phenomenologically monist through and through. Henry Suso, John Roysbrock, for instance. So Pike says the differences are clearly doctrinal and not phenomenological, hence Stace and Smart are right. But, Pike says, there's still a way to secure a third type of mysticism. He says, distinguish between the phenomenal content of certain dualistic states of theistic consciousness. So the prayer of quiet, that's Teresa of Avila, and full union, states of rapture, states of ecstasy, and then assume that these four categories of perhaps proto-mysticism, we might call it, is union without distinction. So again, 1 through 4 are phenomenologically dualist. There's God and there's the soul, and the soul doesn't lose a sense of self. Yet 5, which is the climax, all uplifted spirits are melted and knotted in the essence of God, as Roysbrock puts it. So this is phenomenological monism at the climax. Pike says the dualistic stage peaks in a monistic interval lacking subject-object structure, as well as all sensory and sensory-like content. So here's the challenge for Pike. If 1 to 4 here are mere stepping stones on the way to the monistic interval, as he calls it, how can there be 3 distinct phenomenological types of mysticism? Here's how he proceeds. He says, consider case 1 where I am sitting on a park bench and I'm unexpectedly hit in the head with a baseball. Upon awakening, I describe the experience as sun stars and fading consciousness. Now, later, an observer tells me I was hit in the head with a baseball, such that thereafter I describe the experience as being hit on the head with a baseball. Yet that's not part of the primary experience. Now, contrast that with case 2, where I see the ball hit, I watch it, and I lose it in the sun, and the next thing I know, I experience sun stars and fading consciousness all over again. So this time when I awake, I know I've been hit in the head with a baseball because of the phenomenological ancestry of the experience as a whole. So in case 1, being hit with a baseball is not something perceived, but it is in case 2. Sun stars and fading consciousness, Pike thinks, is to union without distinction what the phenomenological ancestry of seeing the ball hit and losing it in the sun is to states 1 to 4, which precede union without distinction. I hope that's clear enough. Perhaps it's not, but we'll move on regardless. So Pike says that the climax moment, that is the monistic climax moment, is preceded by a specifically theistic experience with dualistic structure. And this phenomenological ancestry, he thinks, is what can ground the distinction between mystical types 2 and 3. It's clever, but does it work? We can debate about this, and I go back and forth, but I think probably not. I want to say that the climax itself is what is relevant in mystical experience. If you isolate that, then types 2 and 3, in Pike's case 1 and 2 with the baseball example, are absolutely identical. If we consider the phenomenal ancestry, moreover, there doesn't seem to be any reason in principle to rule out an infinite variety of distinct types of mystical experience. Why are we privileging mystical experiences which have a theistic phenomenological ancestry and not any type of phenomenological ancestry, if that makes sense? A bigger problem that neither Pike nor Zahner, nor, to my knowledge, any other Christian scholar raises is this. Why does a metaphysically dualistic system, or why should it, climax in phenomenological monism? To me, it seems a bit queer that there's a climactic identity of the monistic mystic and the theistic mystic. Why should that be the case? And this is not answered neither by Pike nor by Zahner, nor is it discussed. Okay. In the short amount of remaining time that I have, I want to consider a way forward. The first step in a contribution of my own towards further engagement with comparative mysticism. The question of questions is this for Christians, I think. What is going on in mystical experience? We can't sidestep it. Something clearly authentic is going on, something profound, at least for the mystic. Now, building on Zahner's typology, which I think is fundamentally right, even if we can quibble with theistic mysticism, and then building off also Pike's analytic rigor, I would also like to remedy their theological and exegetical blind spots and deficiencies to take a step forward. So here's the proposal, and this is where we're going to get a bit weird, but that's okay because in my book, existence itself is a bit weird. That's why we're all here. Bear with me, and we can talk about it a bit in the Q&A if it does get a little bit too weird. Okay, so isolate one type of mystical experience. Let's take Taoism because I'm most familiar with that as an Eastern philosophy, okay? Taoism seems pretty clearly to be nature mysticism, type 1. So you look at the Chuangzi or the Tao Te Ching, for instance, and even in the Liezi, it's the philosophical type of Taoism, in any case, is pretty clearly nature mysticism, at least when the sage has seen reality as it truly is, or as he says. Now, what seems especially interesting to me, and this is something that's frequently talked about in the mystical literature, is the apparent phenomenological similarity, if not identity, with the psychedelic experience. And as we know, lots of nature mystics, traditional nature mystics in the past, have indeed used psychedelics in order to facilitate their mystical experiences. So Houston Smith rightly says, the question that drugs pose for the phenomenology of religion is whether these experiences that are induced differ from the religious experience reached without them, and if so, how? Okay. So, Imperial College London today has been running a series of psilocybin trials, that is the active ingredient in psychedelic mushrooms. A recent paper that's come out, this is the thesis. He says, a psychedelic state is considered an exemplar of primitive or primary state of consciousness that preceded the development of modern adult human normal waking consciousness. Neuroimaging data with psilocybin shows that the defining feature of these primary states is elevated entropy in certain aspects of the brain function. Now, more particularly, there is a marked lack of connectivity between the various regions that go to make up the default mode network. And this DMN is what gives us, or at least helps to give us, a sense of self and recognition of the passage of time. It's what, in short, distinguishes human beings from the other animals. So if this is both what nature mysticism gives us, the sense of a loss of ego, a loss of self, and yet an identity with the surrounding world, if this is the same in both the psychedelic case and in the nature mystical case, it seems like we might have some grounds for doing some serious comparative mystical work. Now, in biblical terms, Zahner says this seems, Taoism and the psychedelic experience, he says elsewhere, seems to be a return to the original innocence of the Garden of Eden, before man reached the age of reason and had tasted of the tree of knowledge. That is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what Taoism gets you to is this state of ultimate and undifferentiated unity, to lose which is to lose the security in responsibility, which is the privilege of the animal world, and in which there is knowledge of neither good nor evil, right nor wrong, life nor death. And this is coming from a Roman Catholic such as Zahner himself. Now, just in closing, I'd like to say also that lots of contemporary biblical scholarship it does back this sort of proposal, not, of course, with the psychedelics, but seeing Adam and Eve as falling from a state of solidarity with the animals and into this new state of self-awareness and self-consciousness, wherein ethical responsibility before God and before fellow men becomes a possibility for the first time. So it's not too crazy, though I'm very curious to.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was Daniel Spencer from University of St. Andrews, Scotland. Do we have any questions on site? Or we can move to the WebEx participants. I see a lot of people have joined. Do you have any questions? Yes, Sylvia, go on. I can see Sylvia, Parker, Piotr. Okay, just please unmute yourself, Sylvia.
Just two very brief questions. The first one, do you think that philosophical solipsism may be considered a kind of mysticism? And the second one, what about dreams? If they appear to be real, sometimes while you are dreaming, you are convinced, you believe that the dream is real, a real experience. So what is the difference between dreams, this kind of dreams, and mystic experience?
Thanks for those questions. To the first one, philosophical solipsism, I'd say, yeah, that's in many ways mysticism par excellence. I think that's lots of mystics do have a sort of solipsistic tendency. As to the second one, yeah, I've not thought a lot about dreams. Though it's really interesting because in the Upanishads, there's lots. Can everyone hear me, by the way? There's lots of material in the Upanishads which talk about sort of the mystical ascent being identical with various states of dream and sleep. Are you sort of asking how, by what methods we can actually know that we're not in a dream state now? Am I understanding you right?
I thought from both from an ontological point of view and from an epistemological point of view.
Yeah, goodness. I'm sure a couple of the people here could really help me out with that. For me, it's just sort of it's an a priori datum, I guess, that this is the real world. I don't know how I could argue that on, I don't know if I can convince everybody of it, but I'll let others do that work for me if that's not a cop-out.
I think already Roman in Garden did it for you. That was the phenomenologist who was arguing for the existence of the external world. Okay, do we have any more questions? Parker, I saw you raising hand. Go on.
Thanks for this, Daniel. This is really intriguing. So first is the clarificatory question. And if I'm understanding, I have what I see to be an objection. So based on the very end of your presentation, I want to be clear that the state of elevated consciousness can be seen theologically as a result or an effect of original sin. Is that true?
Yeah. So okay. I'll preface. I'll just say briefly. So mysticism and philosophy, like this is sort of my first step in this direction. My PhD work is on original sin.
Right.
I think so. Yes, yes and no. Right. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. To me, my reading of Genesis 2 and 3 is they lacked the rationality that we have today, the knowledge of good and evil, these sorts of things. This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you can see various parallels not only in systems like Taoism, but in the Epic of Gilgamesh with Enkidu, the wild man, right? But it seems to me people always want to say, oh, this sort of new way of seeing, and this step from monistic almost or nature mystical consciousness to dualistic consciousness where we become persons and we become ethically responsible. Oh, original sin must mean that we need to get back to the garden. Categorically not. That's not what Christianity is about. Does that help?
Yeah, that does clarify. Yeah, I don't mean to infer that we ought to return. I'm just trying to track the cause and effect. If the elevated state of consciousness can be seen as an effect, or as the result of the original sin. So it seems like I'm tracking. So by my lights, there might be a startup problem. So if you assume reason is kind of a precondition to make a responsible type of choice, then you might run into the startup problem of responsibly choosing to eat the apple or whatever fruit it may have been. And if reason is a product of the elevated state of consciousness, then how do you get reason prior to being in that state of elevated consciousness?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Parker. No, I think that objection is right on. I don't see. So there's sort of three stages in the temptation there. Eve saw that it was a delight to the eyes and good for food and desirable to make one wise. it seems to me that there's a way that you could get the temptation off the ground without saying that there's anything fully rational about it. Now, is there some type of rationality that distinguishes the beasts from human beings? I would say, sure, call it maybe a hemi-distinction between the animals and the humans. And again, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see this with Enkidu, who he runs with the animals, he feeds with them. The animals are not scared of him, and he's naked, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. But the one thing that distinguishes Enkidu initially from the animals is that he can detect the hunter's traps, and he can foil them so that he and his animal buddies can just sort of get on with business. And that's actually what leads to the temptation in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which brings Enkidu out of nature and into civilization with Gilgamesh.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
All right. We have some time for one or two questions more. If there are any, please just unmute yourself and ask Daniel. Anyone?
If there's no questions, can I just make one point of clarification that I don't think I was able adequately to express in the presentation? As you can tell, I was running out of time. What I am not saying, and I hope it's clear, is that, I mean, in some types of mysticism, I would say some types of mystical experiences can probably be induced by drugs or entheogens, as they're sometimes called. But what I'm not saying is this is what Christianity is about, and Christian religious experience can be approximated by use of drugs or by perhaps various types of meditation. What I'm saying is, to the extent that there's a phenomenological similarity between the Taoist mystical experience and the psychedelic mystical experience, to the Christian, if we look from Eden onward to new creation, where we'll talk about that. From a Christian point of view, I want to say this Taoist mysticism actually represents a step backwards and not to the new creation towards which God is calling us on, if that makes sense.
Okay, Daniel, I received one comment on the stream. I will read it to you. It's not a strictly question as it seems, but maybe you will make a comment to this. It's a bit poetic. It goes following. At the top of the mystics, there is one. The differences are only in the valleys of doctrines. What would you say to this?
I would say a lot to it. I love it. I love all the questions that are implicit in that comment. This is like a big part of the project that I'm working on, and you see it with one of the guys, Henri Lassalle, better known today as Abhishektananda. He's the Benedictine monk who went off to India. It's a very, very common claim that at the height, right at the zenith, which is mystical experience, this is one across all religions and across all philosophies. The perennial philosophy is what it's called. What I would say as a Christian, and some Christians would obviously disagree. My Christianity begins with the one thing that Christianity cannot be said to have in common with any other philosophy or religion, and that's not the Trinity, that's not the incarnation, it's not some code of ethics, it's the resurrection of Jesus, the physical resurrection of Jesus. If we make that our starting point, then I think the perennialist claim becomes extremely problematic, especially because the perennialist Christians, we might call them, love to spiritualize away the resurrection. It's an allegory. It's a metaphor. It's really about this death and resurrection of the ego. Whereas if we do, really nice first century historical spade work, I think we get a different picture about what Christianity is all about.
Okay, I will read the very last comment I see right now. Daniel, what do you say? Isn't that too close to the Huxley view on religion?
Yes, but I'm pushing back against Huxley. I think Huxley is totally wrong. Yeah. And Huxley himself thinks he's totally wrong. At the end of his life, there's a recording that his wife has of him, and he basically says, "You know what? I think I may have overstated some of that stuff with mescaline and religion." So Huxley doesn't agree with Huxley.